Hello and welcome to the Out of the Lab podcast, where we discuss the operational challenges in cell and gene therapy. Each episode, we sit down with a different voice in the space, from executives and scientists to patients and advocates, to figure out exactly where the industry is breaking down and how to fix it. This episode is brought to you by Method Made. Accelerate your tech transfer by up to 6 months using video SOPs to capture technical nuance. Take the complete interactive product tour at methodmade.ca. Last thing before we get started, quick shout out to the executive producer, Tatiana Matviva, for her work in guest selection and topic choice. Today we are joined with repeat guest, Hedley. And Hedley, I'm very excited to have you on the show today. And today we're going to discuss a sort of contrast between two philosophies around patenting, around a drug product and the actual process to get there. So maybe to start with, you could give us a brief summary of these two paradigms.
Yeah, sure. Again, I'm old enough to remember how it used to be, Nicholas. And I could use an example of a process patent, the successful launch of Tagamet in 1976, developed by SmithKline and French. The head of the development program was a gentleman known as Sir James Black. He was a physician and a pharmacologist. And it took 12 years to bring Tagamet to market. And the approach that James Black used was basically very innovative. It was termed rational drug design, where you actually identified the receptor that you thought was causing the problem, but you actually experimented with it, worked with it, tried new different methods with it until you actually had evidence that that drug was working on the indication that was required. This Tagamet was for stomach ulcers, and it was very successful. And it was the process that was patented, not the molecule, because if they'd have patented the molecule, the initial thought on the molecule, it wouldn't have been the drug they actually came up with after the experimental rational drug design that they went through. So, so that's going back to 1976. And before that, we've had penicillin, again, which was another process patent, not a molecule patent. And the actual patent of molecules started in the mid-1980s, and it's continued on ever since. But what we're saying is that with a molecule, you have no idea if you can make it, if you can produce it, even in a small quantity, let alone a fully scaled up quantity. So my suggestion is that we should actually learn from the past and look at, well, yeah, could we develop a process, even if it's small scale? For penicillin, it was only a small gram quantities. But once you've got the proof of concept evidence of safety and efficacy, then you can build this. The supply chain that developed and delivered that evidence can be scaled up in a way, in a very controlled way, and the patent then would then be awarded at a point in time that that people thought was correct. So that's my thinking there.
One thing that I'm sort of curious about is, what are the sort of implications on the life cycle of drug development under this alternative paradigm of patenting a process versus a product?
Well, of course, along with that, we had the vertically integrated pharmaceutical companies, SmithKline and French, as a global organization of the whole manufacturing complex. They had all the research scientists, the DMPK people. They were all part of the same company, and that was the difference. Then SmithKline and French had the finances, because they would have been principally funded by shareholders. They would have had good long-term investors, and they would have invested the time early stage. And I also keep saying we should be investing in non-clinical development, because that's the foundation of your supply chain. And we're not investing in it because these days we have small biotech companies who do not have the basic funding. Venture capital funding is limited. It's very limited in the early stages. So we don't have the full investment in the foundation of the supply chain. And then we basically created problems for ourselves further down the line. So, I think we'd be foolish not to at least consider what's gone in the past.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Now, on a practical level, what would actually, given where we are today, what would actually be involved to move in that direction?
Well, I think we've got to bring clinicians, physicians, doctors, call them what you will, back into drug development. Over the last 40 years, clinicians have just, we've had scientists, molecular modeling, and, trying to find these molecules and patenting them. And when a doctor eventually sees the drug when it's launched, they basically had no input to the whole thing. And if it's an indication that they are world-class experts in, why not involve them at the start? The principles that I'm trying to advance is the fact that when you develop a drug, you need two key skill sets. You need the physician, clinician, who might make the chance observation, the chance finding, whatever you want to call it, and the experts in early stage drug development. So with penicillin, it was Fleming and it was Oxford University. So you need to do the DMPK, the drug metabolism, pharmacokinetics, toxicology. You need to do all those things to prove that the compound you've manufactured, and this is key, you have to carry these tests out on a manufactured compound. It's no good, it's no good testing a molecular structure because it doesn't make any sense. So and that can be done in the hospital environment, in the grounds of a hospital. Hospitals have, obviously, they've got pharmacies. They've got the patients. So hospitals have got the end users and the clinicians. They've got project managers. They've got grounds where they have materials handling equipment. They've got lots of equipment. So there's no reason why we couldn't look at bringing small volume manufacture into the hospital setting. And particularly with things like gene therapy, autologous therapy especially, we could start to make small quantities. It would have to be under GMP, but that's about skills training, as I've said before. And I'm sure doctors would love to know a lot more. Doctors who have an interest, not every doctor would, but doctors who have an interest would love to understand more about GMP and see the power of the safety that you could develop if you have standard operating procedures and if you have a strict regime of how you handle your materials and your products. So, and then, I remember Dr. Pierre Corey with ivermectin through COVID. If he could have repurposed ivermectin, that would have allowed any doctor, and got it licensed, that would have allowed any doctor to use ivermectin in this indication of a respiratory condition. As it happened, there were restrictions, but what I'm saying now, post-COVID, any doctor who's using a generic drug that he thinks could work in another indication, and he can collect the real-world data and the real-world evidence that the FDA are asking for of how this drug could work in a clinical sense, and the safety data should be there if it's generic anyway. They just need to understand how CMC works. The Common Technical Document, Module 3, what you have to do to set up a supply chain and manage a supply chain. And, I've written a lot on that, and I would say it's not rocket science, but it does, it takes a lot of time, but that's what we need. We've lost the idea that the supply chain is pivotal to all drug development in that the supply chain is pivotal to a new aircraft or a new automobile or whatever it is, because that's what the users get. And with pharmaceuticals and biologics, obviously, that product is going into their body. So it has to be absolutely squeaky clean through development, manufacture, and distribution. That's the other, with cold chain now, distribution is becoming a key quality attribute as well.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you're really emphasizing that CMC should potentially, well, it sounds like it should be sort of the center stage of the IP when we're talking not just about the discovery, but really about the commercialization of these drugs.
Yeah. It's about, to me, I think the discovery phase we don't need. Now, it might sound confrontation, but that's not how the industry worked up until Tagamet. You developed a compound within your company, and you looked at all the evidence, and you built of what sort of compound could work, and you build a way of building a small, and this is how it works. You build a small supply chain, you test what comes out of that. That's not what you want. Then you build another small supply chain with maybe a different molecule or whatever. And you keep that repetition going until you come, and this is what happened with Tagamet. And if you research Sir James Black and Tagamet, you'll see, so they didn't hit on one molecule and say, right, the mechanism of action is ABC, so which is a complete guess.
Mm-hmm.
And we know with Alzheimer's, tau and beta amyloid, they've been associated with Alzheimer's, and there must have been 35 or 50 or 40 late stage. I'm not talking about late stage failures. I'm talking about, phase 3 failures where there's been billions of dollars spent on the drug development program. So mechanism of action, to me, hasn't proven itself, because the biological, what happens inside your body, I sometimes say, what's the most complex, the sky or your body? We can develop planes to fly in the sky. We use predictive technologies. We use wind tunnels and all these different things, computer simulation, and that's why planes fly in the sky. But when we put medicine into a patient's body, we don't understand the biology, so we have to find safe prototyping methods. And now with NAMS coming along with FDA, a lot more emphasis on innovation at the very early stage, so you can predict if a compound is going to be toxic, so you don't even start to develop it, or if it's, and things like solubility of a compound, they're all crucial in putting a supply chain together. So I think, I don't know if that makes sense, but I honestly feel that.
Yeah, I think that does. Now, at the beginning, we briefly talked about some sort of historical precedents, but yeah, I'd love to sort of dig back in to better understand that. And yeah, I know you have like a very clear perspective on this.
Yeah. Well, I'm like a broken record with penicillin, and I've got a 4-minute animation on it, and it basically shows, how penicillin was developed. But then it shows that in the 1980s, the industry outsourced for reasons that with the Tagamet Glaxo battle of the anti-ulcer drugs. The outsourcing came along and the offshoring came along because the industry started to believe that, well, what's more important is the marketing skills rather than the manufacturing skills. Mm-hmm. We know now that was a strategic error. Again, in my opinion. So when you go back to that's the animation that I do to help people understand. When you've got an integrated supply chain, you've got a single quality system, you're very joined up, people know their role, and it is all about integration of the critical assets that you need to develop a drug. Now, your critical assets as well as our IP, you know, and this applies to any company. I quote Professor Andrew Cox, who is a legend in the procurement world. He talks about post-contractual moral hazard, and he talks about other things. And one of the main things he says, that critical assets are what you need as a business to differentiate your product from the competition. So, like Apple, you know, they've got their critical assets. It's heavily into manufacture. You know, they have to be able to build iPhones. And it's those things you think, well, if my competitor had this, you know, and what I've got, then he's going to compete against me. So you've got to keep your critical assets in-house, and you've got to hang on to them for grim death. And unfortunately, with that, you know, the case with Pharma is that they've lost their critical assets, and now we have CDMOs and CROs who actually own the critical assets. So there must be a point somewhere now where there is a return to the right amount of integration so that the critical assets are returned to the product license holders, the companies who are competing with other companies. So you sort of, instead of competing on patents, you're competing on the quality and the effectiveness of your product, which is what every other industry sector relies on. And we see now with Novo Holdings acquiring Catalent, that is a major event because, okay, this is specific about one drug, it's specific about the GLP-1 products, about getting capacity and that whole thing. But it does show, it does exemplify the fact that, you know, Novo Holdings and Novo Nordisk now have got in-house critical assets. Now it's still to be seen how they're going to use them. Are they going to use them to develop, even now they've got these skills in-house? You know, potentially they lose the post-contractual moral hazard. The contractors embed in the same organization as the company developing the product license, better relationships, you know, shared rewards between people in the company. I think that is a model going forward that all big pharma companies should be looking at and doing it pretty quickly, because if you recognize the fact that the supply chain is so key and you don't have a supply chain of your own, then, you know, that is potentially a major issue. I'm not seeing in the industry on LinkedIn, I'm seeing a lot more now about lack of fragility in the supply chain, and single sourcing and some of the other aspects. But what I'm not seeing is investors in the more advanced therapies actually understanding how much the supply chain is crucial to a return on their investment. And when that starts to hit home, I think, when investors start to realize how important the supply chain is in CMC and how you can actually beat the competition if you've got in-house resources that are able to differentiate your product, then the world's your oyster, if you like.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so you mentioned one professor earlier. Now, in a previous discussion, you mentioned a quote about an MIT professor, and I'd love to sort of get into that and how it sort of fits into this view.
Okay, yeah, well, this is, many people listening here will know Ed Schein, Professor Ed Schein. He writes on leadership and culture. He's so brilliant. And one of the key aspects that he talks about is basic assumptions. You know, when you go into an organization, it's not, you experience a sort of culture. You see sort of charts on the wall saying customer is king, and you see all these sort of obvious things that you can see about how the business runs itself. But there's a set of basic assumptions that underlie the way the business works. Unspoken assumptions, no one talks about them, no one really understands them. It's just they're there. And it's the same in every industry sector. And what I did in my book, Transforming the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain, I won't read too much of this, but I wrote about my thoughts on what today's basic assumptions were in the industry. And so I've got 8 of them here. The starting point for new products is scientific discovery. This involves a relentless search by talented scientists, leaving no stone unturned in seeking out molecules that have the potential to cure unmet medical needs, aka blockbusters. Mm-hmm. These molecules come from a patented portfolio to hold possible competition at bay. Once patented, the clock is ticking, so press on as quickly as possible into the clinic. There's little time to spend checking the molecule for suitability to meet the rigors of market supply. The vast majority are going to fail, so keep investment to a minimal until late-stage clinical trials. Regulators hold the golden key of approval. Keep them happy, but tell them only what they need to know or ask for. Once a drug is approved, spending on mass marketing is essential. Mega high prices are necessary because drug development is astronomically expensive. Drug side effects are unfortunate, but patients live with them. So, and that's my interpretation of how I think the basic assumptions in the industry. And then I came up with a new set of basic assumptions that, to me, I think make a whole lot more sense. So again, I've got 8. It is the supply chain that delivers drugs into a person's body. As such, the safety and integrity of the supply chain is of paramount importance. Product license holders are in the business of designing, making, and delivering value for money medicinal products to end users. This is their core mission in life. The starting point for the new product is the patient and the clinicians that serve them, end users. The end user value proposition must be fully understood and is the primary driver of the end-to-end supply chain or value chain, with all stages of production and distribution aligned to deliver on that proposition. It is impossible, this is a key one, it is impossible to predict what a drug will do to the body and what the body will do to the drug without study of the drug produced by the supply chain. Failure to get a drug to market is bad, not the unavoidable cost of doing business. Everything should be done to prove safety before testing animals and humans. The key to regulatory approval is not with the regulator, it is with the companies developing drugs taking the lead on patient well-being. Markets should be properly segmented based on a deep understanding of patient needs and outcomes, and that effectively is precision medicine. So we are with a set of assumptions, and I would always take feedback from anyone who thinks it's different to that. And I just think we need to follow Ed Shine's advice and say, let's develop a new set of basic assumptions. Let's surface what's there at the moment and say, we need to replace them. And that's the job of all stakeholders. And at the end of the book, I go through what stakeholders can do to make things better. And I talk about, the FDA, first of all, they shouldn't be telling regulators, for instance, they shouldn't have a distinction between the production unit and the quality unit. Because what we learned from modern production system is that production are responsible for the quality. So production should be, the pharma companies should developing methods based on 21st century production systems where they're not looking for the quality. The quality department is there to assure quality, but the main owners of quality is the production department. So what I'm saying is, over the years, regulation for all the best motives have been so prescriptive that the pharma companies are not really able to bring in these new ways of building supply chains based on aerospace, automotive, and the whole thing. Then we have, we've got universities need to basically need to understand that doctors, particularly medical schools, they need to be taught in CMC. They need to have a good understanding of supply chain. A pilot, if you said to a pilot, how do you think the plane is made? He could tell you straight away. You ask a doctor how a drug is made, and they may not even know what CMC is. So I think and the absolute key to this is changing patent law, because compound claims allows companies to claim a molecule. They've got the patent. They can fail as often as they like, but they've only got to get one product to market, and sales and marketing then will make it a blockbuster. And that's not good for society. It's not good for anyone. So I think there should be a real global consultation on process patents being the vehicle by which drug developers get a patent. I do write about an example of if someone was developing a new tire for the car, and they developed a formula for the rubber which makes the car hold the road better, and they went into the into the patent office. They said, look, I've got this process, I want to patent it. I've got this rubber that will help the car hold the road better. Well, the patent officer would say, well, okay, then where's the data that says that holds the road better when the tire is made and on the car? Oh, we haven't got any data that says that. Well, you can't have a patent, because a patent is about a commercial idea that's going to be commercialized, and it secures a company for that idea. It secures a company's reward over a certain period of time. But if the patent isn't proven that it's going to do something commercially, it isn't. If it's just a molecule, then I'd argue why is one awarded?
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. It really touches on the requirements for patent, including like novelty. Now, you mentioned about how this isn't necessarily good for society, this current model, and I'm curious about, in the case of like advanced therapeutics, like cell therapies, where they're very expensive on an individual basis, how that sort of ties into the current patent paradigm.
I don't know. Because I'm not an expert. I'm not a lawyer in patent law. I'm not an expert. I just think I try to use common sense and work things out. But because biologics are such large molecules, as I said last time, the pharmaceutical supply chain is based on small molecule products where you can draw a chicken wire diagram of the molecule, and that together with a mechanism of action theory allows you to get a patent. I don't know, because I don't think you can draw a biologic molecule because it's so large. So I honestly don't know how they are getting patents on those. Obviously, some of them will know. But what I'm saying is, it's not helpful anyway, because you don't know if it's just a molecule. You don't know if you can make it, and that is the key. So, and that's why I said we should be doing this in hospitals. We should be prototyping in hospitals, because, and there is an article. David Mitchell sadly died. He had terminal cancer, but he ran Patients with Affordable Drugs, and he went over to Novartis when Kymriah was approved in 2017 at $475,000 a treatment. He flew over to Switzerland to speak to Joe Jimenez, who was the CEO of Novartis at the time, and hoping to get the price down, because he was a real campaigner. He didn't get the price down, clearly, but that price was based on a patent, and I would keep questioning, what is the basis of the patent? And I can't say any more than that, Nicholas, because it's not my area of expertise. But I think we should. And there is someone at Tahir Amin. I think I mentioned this last time. He's campaigned a lot. I think he's given evidence in front of the Senate, and he is asking the right questions. But obviously, he needs a lot more support in terms of the sort of things that I'm saying here about the cost of awarding patents when we don't know it can be made.
Yeah, well, that sort of makes. I mean, that definitely makes sense. And even not as a lawyer, but I'm also curious about another aspect of patenting, which is around shared understanding of mistakes, and how this might be interesting to sort of compare various different industries. So what I see, in particular around CMC, is that due to the strict intellectual property laws, there's a lot of people who end up repeating each other's mistakes in different companies because they can't really talk openly about it. And yeah, I'd be curious on your perspective on this and how it fits in here.
Yeah, well, it makes me smile in a way, because I must have signed so many NDAs, CDAs, non-disclosure agreements, confidential disclosure agreements. I couldn't tell you how many I've sent. We're working with a drug development company, but I know it's not IPR because, I know at this stage, they don't know if they've got a drug. So, I don't see it's right that you could call it IPR, because IPR is supposed to be commercializable. And if you haven't got evidence the drug is going to work, and the industry is full of confidentiality agreements all over the place. And as I say, 99% of the information probably isn't confidential. And why aren't people sharing? It's this concept that we've got this very secret idea that, this is going to be a wonderful drug, but no one must know about it because we've got to get it to market first. Yeah, but you don't know if you've got a drug. So how would you know it's a very good secret idea? And so, and this is another example of basic assumptions, the assumptions in the industry that everything is secret.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if it's not of any value, or you haven't proven, you haven't got the proof that it works, then it's pointless keeping it secret, because no one's going to steal it off you because it doesn't work, or you haven't proved it works.
Yeah, so, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting to sort of compare when we look at other industries. Patents seem to be heavily implicated in the pharmaceutical industry. And there is intellectual property in any product, but there's a lot more to it. And, when you're talking about the supply chain as sort of a key thing, when we were talking about airplanes, as we were earlier, the invention of an airplane, at this point in the technological development of the world, isn't the big deal. It's really about the unique differences between them, and a lot of that being where those parts come from that really allow people to get from A to B through the air.
Yeah, well, I do the Boeing Dreamliner as an example of how outsourcing can go badly wrong. And that is a key, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is a key example of outsourcing critical assets. I don't know how many people, well, I think quite a few people don't know the background to it, but Boeing, with the Dreamliner, decided to pass risk into the supply network, and they decided to outsource a lot of the manufacture. And when the parts came back, like X years later through development, they didn't fit together. So, and Boeing had to buy their suppliers, either buy them back or buy some of the suppliers, so that they could then have a proper they had then control of the critical assets that it took to make the Dreamliner. But I think there was about a $2 or $3 billion overspend and 18 months, 2-year delay. And to me, that is, that's a factual example of how outsourcing can really take away your competitive advantage. And there's been even more outsourcing in pharmaceuticals, far more, but not just outsourcing, but offshoring as well. So, starting materials, chemical intermediates, APIs, most of them come from China, India, Asian countries, as we know. And so you combine those two, the outsourcing and the offshoring, and there's one other which is then outsourcing drug development to small biotech companies, and you've got the best of the worst of all worlds. You haven't got control over your development program, you haven't got control of your supply chain, and you haven't got control of the sourcing of your materials. So and I'm hoping COVID, with the things that have begun to emerge, is going to make people the industry sit back and think, was it a mistake to go the way we did in the mid 1980s and 90s and onwards?
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and it seems like you're really drawing what I would consider just to be a basic business perspective here in terms of the strategic direction. And I'm just sort of thinking back to those sort of 8 assumption principles that you mentioned earlier. And something that I think is sort of distinct about those 2 paradigms is your sort of proposed method seems much more practical and not very theoretical. And it's interesting because it really reminds me of the transition that happens as people leave the academic world, many of them being PhD students who go on to create these pharmaceutical companies, and the shift in mindset required to really execute and get things done, which is very different from that mindset that's needed to come up with and prove new ideas.
Yeah, about 10 years ago, I've self-published a few books as well, trying to help people understand. I self-published one on Amazon KDP, titled "Science Seduces Pharma: Time for Engineers to Muscle In." That was the title of the book. I didn't sell any, but because science, but actually there's not a lot of science involved. And I don't want to upset, postgrads, PhDs, or whatever, because they're obviously brilliant to get their qualifications. But we know STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, they have to fit together. And the more you move through the life cycle of drug development, the more it's engineering, not science. There's obviously applied science, but as you go on, it's more about putting the plane together, engineering, but also having a clear focus on the people who will be using your products. Because that's the key to anyone selling anything. If you lose sight of the constituents for your product, then you're not going to have a business. The only thing that stopped that happening in pharma is the patenting process.
Yeah, I mean, it brings up a lot of experiences and sentiments in the sort of technology and world of, say, like Silicon Valley, around really just like good product development and what it really means because I think it's important here to consider that a product solves a problem for that end user. It's not, and it never really works to sort of twist and contrive your technical solution. It just usually won't fit the actual need at the end of the day when you do that.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And I talk about Steve Jobs and his, I may mention this last, his purpose, and and I picked up. This is a secondary quote. I mainly talked about him talking about the Apple being the biggest startup in the planet, and the best practice way of managing the whole organization. But he also talked about he wanted to put a computer in the hands of everyone so that they
Mhm.
wouldn't have no code and that sort of thing. And he had a purpose, and if money was his only purpose, then he probably wouldn't have got anywhere. But he was driven by that end result, and if you're failing or not, because if you're not achieving your purpose, then you're going to change what you're doing. Whereas if you're doing it for profit, you don't know if you're achieving any purpose at all, because so you haven't got that steer that says, I know when I'm off course, because I'm not putting a phone in everyone's hands so that they can they do now. So he's instantly knows he's off track. So he's going to bring things back on track. But when you're just bringing in the products, the profits, you can be off track. I think that's what's happened. The industry has been off track for 40 years, and it's beginning to realize, well, I don't know if it is or not, but the outcome that we're seeing now is way off what George Merck said in the 1950s. The more we focus on patients, the more profit we make, and the more we focus on patients, or the more we do that, the more it makes absolute sense. When you're giving people what they want, they'll pay money for it, because it's solving a problem they've got. And I mean, what bigger problem than you get than a health issue?
Yeah, that's as a human, that's pretty much as far as it gets.
Absolutely. So,
wow. Well, we've covered a huge amount of ground today, and it's been a truly insightful conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicholas. I really appreciate it. And I wish you all the best, because I think what you're doing with your podcast and everything, a lot of people should be listening to it. So I do appreciate the time you've given me here.